Roddy, you're very welcome to Kilmore.
Thank
welcome
you.
to Wexford. I don't think it's your first visit here.
It is not, no. Not to Wexford, certainly. That's
Yeah.
where my mother's family came from, Oilgate.
Oh, right. Because
She's a Bulger.
yeah,
Or was a Bulger.
a good Wexford name. Where was your seaside when you were growing up? Because I know there's a lovely little vignette in one of the recent stories where a man looks at his father walking up a beach, and it's Cahor Beach in Wexford. Mm-hmm. And you see the character sees some children running towards the beach, and I was wondering, was that it had the ring of truth about it? And
not particularly Cahor. I think down Kilmore way.
Yeah. So we can kind of claim you.
Oh, by all means, fire away. Yeah, I'm yours for the day.
It's an interest. I find it an interesting question because you're so associated with Dublin.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that this particular conversation is bookended by two sessions about Joyce. Funny enough, Dan Mulhall was just on talking about Ulysses, and then there's a little performance coming after this, also about Joyce. And it's just a coincidence. This is kind of like the Dublin session, but if you're, we'll claim you as Wexford in the middle of it all. Do you have that sense of being a Dublin writer at all, or is it?
Oh yeah, I do. Very much so. I think if I didn't come from the patch of Dublin that I come from, I either wouldn't be a writer or I'd be a very different writer. And I suspect that if I hadn't been a school teacher listening to people talking all day, I'd have been a very different writer. Yeah. So the voices of people from the northeast of Dublin were vital to me, you know. I wasn't conscious of it overly. I thought this is what you do.
Yeah.
But I realise it now that when I'm, getting to know a character, when I'm finding the words for the character, I really do know I'm a product of the part of the world I come from, and that's Dublin. But on the other hand, even the very first book, when I was, putting a shape on it and thinking about these young people forming a band, I knew that's a universal story that happens all over the world. So it's getting that balance between the parish and the globe, so to speak. Not just because there's no point in being true to your dialect if there isn't a story. Do you know what I mean? If it's if it's so, if your determination to capture the accent is so, so intense that you forget that actually, there is more to the world than a couple of square miles where you grew up.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like Billy Roach. I mean, his plays are so Wexford, but at the same time, anybody anywhere in the world will identify the people in those plays.
Yeah. Isn't it? I mean, that Patrick Kavanagh little poem Epic, where he talks about the Munich bother and sort of, it's all about that the universal in the local, and that there's this, while there is this big wide world out there, we may only know this little patch of it, but because we know this little patch of it so well, we actually know the world as well. It's a kind of a peculiar thing,
Yeah, I think it's from the very beginning I'd always, when I was thinking of a character walking down the street, I was thinking, will he turn left or right? And this is a fictional street, so it's entirely my decision.
Yeah.
But I had to think in terms of, well, the sea is to the left. Is he going that way or is he walking in? Because again, I was actually, getting the map and putting a new line on a new street. But I was staying within northeast Dublin all the time. But it was, I don't know. It's just, that's what I ended up doing, trying. When I'm currently working on a novel, and the character is getting to know the character and have a fair good sharp view of her now, and she's a Dubliner. And if you said, like, will you, like Dion Boucicault used to, his play The Streets of Dublin became The Streets of London, became The Streets of New York, depending where he was that day. And if somebody said, could you get that character and plant her somewhere else in Ireland? The answer is no. I wouldn't be able to do it. I wouldn't be confident enough that I'd get the rhythm You know, the little differences that we all, you know, when you shift around, as even a small country like Ireland, there are places of, you know, we probably all nod when there are places on the island where we find it very difficult to understand what's being said. You know, we're talking about Kerry, aren't we?
Yeah, for sure.
So so it's, you know, my job, if you like, it's all words, and the words are the English as spoken in my part of Dublin. It's not even Dublin in a way. It's my part of Dublin. And the story comes out of that, and hopefully it's a story that people will be able to identify with, even if they've never been to Dublin. You know?
And I mean, isn't that Ulysses and Joyce as well? Is that sort of sense of the book is so, Ulysses I'm talking about, is so much about Dublin, and yet I was talking to somebody over lunch, and they were saying about people in Nanjing in China just loved Ulysses, you know.
I think what the success of it is, because it's not Dublin per se. It is obviously, but it's people in Dublin. So it's people talking in a bar in Dublin, in a hotel bar in Dublin. It's Leo Bloom wandering Dublin and showing you Dublin, or Joyce getting Leo Bloom to show you Dublin. That's what's brilliant about it, I think. Not so much, you know, if we decide to do a tour of Dublin and we're looking at all the Joyce, you get bored pretty quickly. You know, it wouldn't be the same as being in the book, and the book is about the people. You know, and he was right. He just stuck one day. You know, a smallish city, one day. But people are the thing that you're reading about.
Absolutely. Just going back to, thinking about that first book, there's a few things I want to pick up on.
We're talking about my book now, not
your
Joyce's.
book, not Joyce's book. No, forget about. We're done with the Joyce bit.
Enough
now.
of him.
That first book, the Commitments, not your first creative work now, but and I suppose this is a writing festival. How easy was it to write that book?
Well, in retrospect, quite easy, because I didn't know that I was breaking rules. And I didn't know that you're not supposed to do that. And I'd spent years writing. I think I was at it for about 4 years. And I didn't really know what I was doing. But when I remember, like January 1986, when I started writing the Commitments, it kind of clicked. This is what I want to do. This is what I'm doing. And I started messing with the spelling to try and get some sort of approximation of the Dublin accent on paper, and deciding, that works. I can add an extra N to anything and it becomes anything. And I'll drop the G and put a comma or an apostrophe and it becomes anything. And people will still see that that's anything. So, and then, you know, others I decided not to. The temptation to put DE for the definite article, THE, I found that easy to avoid, because I thought that would be going too far. And so I left it THE, even though in Dublin they rarely bring the tongue that far out of the mouth. It's too much work involved in that altogether. So that's when I started experimenting, and it began to flow, you know. And I had so the mix of the music. I began to, you know, mess with the lyrics. I was really enjoying it, and at the same time, it was a simple linear story. Bunch of kids form a band. Band has a bit of a career, and then I always knew the band was going to break up, and that was my end. Very vague, but a little tiny glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. The snapper later on, the woman was going to have the baby, and the baby was going to be grand. And 3 years later, I got to that point, but I always knew. So that kind of straight line linear plot. Again, I didn't know it was a linear plot. It's only when you do something that isn't linear you realise that, oh, Jesus, now I know what linear means. So, but it was, relatively easy. I mean, I finished it in June of that year, so it was 6 months. Now, it's a short book, but other people have spent years writing short books. So I think I got through it quickly because it wasn't a difficult second album, if you know what I mean. It was the easy first one. To a degree, I was aware that I was breaking rules, but I didn't know it mattered, and didn't care about. I began to jettison all the stuff, like, am I going to describe the street he's walking down? Now, why would I do that? It just gets in the way. Sometimes with the dialogue, am I going to describe the character's physical characteristics? No. There might be a hint of them now and again, but usually by a slag or an insult that one person throws at the other. That's way more interesting, you know. So a lot of the more conventional stuff about describing, you know, there's no point in describing the architecture. You know, he walked down this row of post-war council houses, you know, designed by no one in particular. So I kind of, it was a liberation in a way to jettison all that, you know. I suppose that would be some of the stuff that would make one anxious. So I wasn't anxious about that at all, and luckily I've never been since. I don't need to be. So the commitments allowed me to break all the rules, and then it also allowed me to endure, in a way, once it was published and up and running, I could enjoy, in a way, both endure and enjoy the reaction to it, you know, being dismissed and stuff like that. I mean, it was grit, really, to the mill, you know, grist, rather, to the mill. I just, it was just, but it was a happy experience writing the book, really, you know. Listening to the music, and there's a bit of glee in it, you know, thinking of putting this black American music in Dublin, and it was one of the, it was, then you go and you write the next book, and because you've written one already, then you begin to think about, oh, what do I do now?
You have a reference point, sort of,
Yeah, and it could be a bit of a burden, you know, you don't want to repeat yourself. And that actually gets no easier because I've written a lot at this stage, you know, I don't know how many, you know, if somebody said how many books have you written, and I'm not boasting, but I don't know. And it's not because I've lost my grip on life, you know, it's just I don't know. And I do find at times when I'm starting something, I think, I've written this before. It's the same with names particularly. The short story collection that came out last year, my editor got in touch. Was the decision to name the man the same name in 3 of the stories deliberate? And no, it wasn't. It was just a complete lack of imagination on my part. Just just basically fucking laziness, really. So I had to change the names, you know, but it worried me a little bit. No harm. You have to be on my toes, you know.
No, just thinking of the early days and the commitments. I was just saying to somebody earlier, the first play I ever went to was Brown Bread.
Really?
Yeah, first play was it on in the Gaiety or somewhere like that, the Olympia or somewhere?
It was on originally in the SFX Centre, which was the Jesuits Parish Hall just off Gardner Street. And it was an amazing stage. It was the Theatre Royal stage. They bought, when the Theatre Royal was demolished, they bought the stage and basically stuck it to the back of a parish hall. And they had bingo in there, you know. So there was a bingo caller on one of the best stages, possibly in Europe. Little did he know that he was, you know. And then there were gigs. It was a friend of mine managed the place, and I saw the Clash there, Echo and the Bunnymen, the Pogues, brilliant gigs, and then plays as well. So my play was the first time there in the SFX Centre.
That was the first play I was ever at. And the reason I'm raising it is there seems to me to be a continuity between a play and writing for the stage and writing for the voice and something like the commitments that's so driven by dialogue. And you've talked already all about your anxiety is the wrong word, but your desire to get the language right, or the timbre of the speech right.
Coincidentally, or maybe it's not coincidence, I was thinking of that, not the play as such, but the term brown bread. When the Queen died the week before last, a friend of mine, you know, I think we all got a lot of stuff over the days, but there was one that had 2 photographs, and one was a slice of white bread and the other was the Queen, and it said brown bread, white bread, brown bread. Dublin slang for dead. And the name of the play was Brown Bread, because I had heard, possibly a year before I wrote the play, a guy in a pub talking about somebody finding their mother came home from the pub and she was there in the kitchen. She was brown bread. And I was thinking about it a few days ago, because, you know, the decision to use the word brown bread, you may not be conscious, but you have to. It's like driving. You come up to the word dead, which is and you kind of bypass the word dead You refuse to use it and go on to the next one, which is brown bread. And it's the extra syllable. There's a built-in humour, which is unavoidable. It's inappropriate in many ways. The guy's talking about somebody's dead mother. And she was brown bread on the floor. So I was thinking about it a few days ago because it's incredibly creative. And it's a big FU to the people who tell you, you're supposed to say this, you're not supposed to say that. So it works in all sorts of ways, you know. So that's one of the reasons why the play was called Brown Bread, because it was so irreverent.
Yeah, yeah.
And such fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned there just about writing, you just having to remember characters' names and, you know, all of that stuff. Like that, the happiness, the glee that you had in writing The Commitments and writing those early books, does that still last? Because I suppose maybe the recent books, they're not happy books.
No. Well, actually, I think probably if you take them all and you start saying happy, unhappy, 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 I suppose, I mean, no, there wouldn't be happy books. I mean, a lot of them aren't. Yeah. Or, I don't know whether it's because one gets older or I never felt, you know, I think when you write a book like The Commitments, you're not claiming this captures all of human life. Yeah. And I think you go and then you write another book, and then you're beginning to look, I'll get out of this house and I'll move across the road and I'll have a look into the window of this house. Oh, it's not so good in there. Yeah. I'll write about this. So when I'm working, I'm just thinking about words, literally words all the time. The words, the right words to use, the right words to reject. And there are moments, certainly, when it doesn't matter what the subject matter is. If something seems like a good idea and I've captured it and I'm reading over it the following morning, say, before I move on, and I realise I'm not going to touch that paragraph again, it's exactly as I want it. And I hadn't planned that, you know, it was an idea that I might have had, it just came into my head. There's a certain, it's more than just satisfaction, there's a certain joy in that, you know. And it doesn't matter, as I said, it could be describing something really horrible, but if it's well captured, I'm happy. Yeah. And then I have to go into the morass again and drag out words and put them together. And I love my job. I really love doing it, and I can't imagine not doing it. But I don't think you should go into your work happy. Now, this work. This work. Yeah. Happiness is an option, you know. But I think if I was a teacher still, I'd like to work myself up into a state of happiness before I start the day. Yeah. Because I'll be in bits by the end of the day, so I might as well start on a high. But happiness is appropriate there, if you like, or trying to make a happy room, a happy atmosphere. But I think when I'm writing, no, happiness I don't necessarily want. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think so. I mean, I think you're making a very serious point. You know that.
Well, it's Saturday afternoon, and so why not? The weather's good outside, so I thought I'd bring a bit of misery into There's no football on. Yeah,
I think there's a really good book by of letters between Frank O'Connor and William Maxwell, the editor of the New Yorker, who did his short stories, and it's called "The Happiness of Getting It Down Right." Yeah, and I think that's what you're saying. I mean, there is a deep satisfaction in getting it down right.
Yeah, I think you know it's the craft. I think. I would imagine, now, I'm no good at my hands, but I would imagine if I was a craftsman and I did a carpenter or something and I fashioned something really and I was really, really satisfied, you have to be that satisfaction is happiness's first cousin. Yeah. So you're finished with it, but then you're on to the next one. Yeah. And you can't bring that with you because I think what happens, there's a certain self-satisfaction might be in the room or a bit of arrogance. Well, I can do this, I've done it before, this is easy. Yeah. And I think we've read those books now and again. Great writer comes out with a really ho-hum one. Yeah. And then there are those who deliver again and again and again and again. And that's because I think they're in the right mental state as much as anything else. They have the skill, but it's the right mental state, I think.
It's and that craft. I mean, like somebody making furniture. I mean, there's a certain drudgery about it too, isn't there?
Yeah.
Do you have? And again, we're talking to writers and people trying to write here. Do you have a room that you go to, that I have to be in that room. I have to have a particular kind of notebook from Paris, or I have to have a particular kind of pen, or I write on an Olivetti typewriter, or is there a...
The pen comes from Hanoi.
Hanoi.
And the notebook comes...
I
have to go to Hanoi to have it handmade, because it has to fit my hand. My hand is particularly unique. No, in a way, no, I don't. I do have an office. I have actually two offices. I've one at home in my house, and I've one now in the city centre. But I go into the office, and the office in the city centre, I love having it, but it's like the same size as a box bedroom, and there's very little in it. There's a couple of pictures, and there's a very basic desk, and there's a chair that doesn't have wheels, that doesn't have any of the, I don't know what the phrase is, the stuff that'll stop me from needing major back surgery in 10 years' time. It's just a chair, and I have a laptop, and I don't need any special gonks. Cup of good coffee, and I listen to music. Or I'm not listening to the music, but it's there. And both places where I work, if I open the window, I'm going to hear noise, and that is often very welcome. The more suburban noise from home, like dogs barking, occasionally sirens, builders shouting in different languages. In the office in town, way more sirens, a lot of beer kegs being rolled down cobbles. Nothing musical about that sound at all, actually. It's dreadful, but again, it's part of the urban texture. Seagulls, being Dublin, seagulls. So these things sometimes end up in the stories, other times not. I think it's... So there's that kind of privacy, and at the same time an awareness that there is a world out there. But I do need it's sitting at a desk, so it is to a degree drudgery. I'm at a point in the novel I'm working on where I want to write 1,000 words a day. And say Thursday I wrote 2,000, and I nearly had a nosebleed. And do you get a day off if you write two, or do you still say I've got to? I would. I'd kind of I do Mitch now and again. Right. I'm looser with time than I used to be. But when you know I'm writing a book now, so 1,000 words a day. And they accumulate then. By the end of the month you've got if you printed it out, that's a fairly hefty manuscript you've got in your hands already. And I find when I start, quantity is more important than quality, because if you have the quantity, in other words, if you have lots of words, then you can start being picky, and then you can start going at it with the proverbial red biro, and choosing and picking and choosing. If you start that too early, I've found over my life, if you start that too early, it's difficult to measure progress, and you have to kind of be kind to yourself in that way. So, but I do have the routine, but... if you're not at a desk of some sort, or if you're not sitting, the words aren't going to come, because it's hard to measure. I miss sometimes. I never worked straight onto a typewriter. I never did that. I hand wrote, and then actually I recall renting a typewriter a few times. But the noise of an electric typewriter is the nearest thing to labour, I think, that you can convince people that you're working, because there is that notion, it must be magical, and very often biographical depictions of writers, it's very rarely do you see them actually writing. They're drinking, they're writing, they're not writing, so that's, it is like, it's what you're doing is filling pages with words, and the typewriter captures that much better, I think, that padoom sound brilliantly. I believe there's an app you can get, and you can you can have the typewriter noise on your laptop. The temptation is to get one for the phone. You're on the bus. Padoom, 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 padoom.
It's kind of like a loom or something, like the novel or the piece of work is being woven on it. God. Them were the days, They were real books back then when they were written on typewriters.
You'd be sweating after a day,
I guess you use what you have, and but I think the point you make there about the discipline of the thing and showing up. I mean, I don't, some of the writers you read about, part of it is showing up and putting in the time.
Absolutely, a lot of ideas. You might, you've got these notions again. You wander the hills till you get the right word. I mean, I'd be wondering,
Yeah.
way past the Himalayas at this stage, waiting for the
Yeah,
right
yeah,
word. You
yeah.
won't get the right word unless you put down the wrong ones
Yeah,
very
yeah.
often. Then you get the right one. So you have to put words on the page, and it's not just the words. Sometimes, I mean, several, yes, over the last few days when I've been writing, several things have happened. Several things I've made my character do or think that I hadn't anticipated.
Yeah.
I really hadn't anticipated it. And I would never, ever, ever have thought of them just wandering or drinking a cup of coffee in a cafe or, the cliche stuff,
Yeah,
walking the
yeah,
beach.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
One of the reasons you'd walk the beach is not to have thoughts about writing.
yeah. To avoid writing even.
Yeah. So the way to do the writing, you
Yeah.
have to do the writing to get
Yeah,
the writing.
yeah.
And it's the same, it's not just the words, it's the ideas as well. Bad ideas often produce good ideas, funnily enough, when you're editing.
Yeah.
You're thinking, oh, this is a bit ho-hum, but then the fifth sentence is the one that you really want, but you have to write the other four to get there.
And do you, would you write a draft through, would you sort of get to the end as best you can and then
I'd
go
certainly
back?
write a lot before I'd stop and
You
go
know where it's
back.
going.
I've on occasion, I've sensed that I might be 2/3 of the way through. I don't know, but there's enough for me to think, well, there's a lot there, and I'm running out of steam. Inevitably, there's a point where it becomes, like you used the word drudgery a while back, where it does become like the capital D, drudge, actually all the letters. And like there's no end in sight. So then I might go back to the beginning and just start sorting it out and see what's there, what's missing, maybe fill it a bit, and then that momentum will bring you to, in my experience, will often bring me to the end. But I'd prefer just to keep going. Because, there's always the temptation to start something else. I think a lot of people do that thing because it's exciting. Starting something else is exciting. But it's also, if you're working on something, it's avoiding the drudgery, so to speak. And the drudgery is an important part of it.
Yeah. And I imagine a certain kind of paralysis can creep in if you're editing and editing and re-editing, and that's the wrong word, and I'll try this word, and then it'll go back. And
I love editing.
Yeah.
I really love. I think it's the old teacher in me, the red biro. Oh Jesus, I love it. I sniffed the red biro before I started. No, I love it, and I love. There's a point. So I would do 4 drafts of a novel. Generally getting shorter. Then I figure out, well, actually, there's a bit missing here. It makes no sense, so adding. But I love the editing. It's been and that to me as well. Like, if you get to the end of it, then you can start editing it.
Yeah.
It's like if you eat your dinner, then you'll get the ice cream.
Yeah.
Sad to say, editing is my ice cream.
Yeah.
I love it.
What did it call it?
I remember, the best thing as an English teacher you could possibly do was use the red biro, as long as the kids understood red isn't bad.
Yeah.
It's not bad. Yeah. And look at the comments at the
Yeah.
So I always felt that the red it's brilliant, and I'd love. I remember it's a strange one. You see, if you're writing a novel, and you come across 3 pages that you wrote maybe 6 months before, and frankly they're not good, and you realise there's nothing worth in it that at all. There's a pleasure in just getting the red biro and going shh, because it's no waste. It's 3 pages out of maybe 472. Grand, and it's crap, and nobody knows that except you, and nobody ever will. Know that except you, and you're not going to go to the local. And guess what I did today? You wouldn't believe how bad my writing was.
I threw out half of the something.
Nobody's interested anyway. That's really, really important. No matter how, nobody gives a shite, and that's the way it should be. So, but if I was doing that, if I was 10 pages in and I went with the red biro at 3 pages, very hard to get motivated
Momentum,
again. So quantity, then quality.
Yeah. And I think that idea is very helpful. That idea of getting the momentum of the book, and not being afraid to go back, but going back at the right time.
Yeah, and I get my red biros in Tierra del Fuego.
Right. Yeah. Well, I find that they do the best red biros.
Best biro, the Spar.
Yeah. The Spar in Tierra del Fuego.
Way at the bottom of Tierra del Fuego, very close to the Antarctic. They have the best red biros, real old school red biros.
I thought everybody knew that.
Every Irish teacher should go there.
Yeah. And could I ask you just about? I'm sort of dipping back into the brown bread thing, the drama and all of that. Just the relationship between the theatre and the, and you've written screenplays as well. And like when you start out on a, as they call it, say a project, do you know? Do you sit down and say, right, I'm going to write a novel now, and I'm starting writing a novel, or do you sort of start writing something and say, geez, this could be a screenplay, or this could be a...
No.
No.
The novels all have been, if you like, I got into my own canoe and started paddling. Nobody suggested them to me.
Yeah.
Didn't have a publisher, don't have a contract, never had a contract for a book I hadn't written, ever. Everything else I've done has often been somebody else's idea or invitation. So when I was writing The Commitments, I was invited to write Brown Bread.
Yeah.
And I saw both, one was published, the other produced in the same year.
Yeah.
The Commitments I was doing, you know, again in my bedsit by myself. Brown Bread, I was invited by two people to write the play. And it's the same with virtually every collaborative thing I've done, a play, screenplay. The one exception, Rosie, the film that came out in 2018, I wrote the plan for that based on it was inspired by a woman I heard being interviewed on the news who had spent the previous days looking for somewhere to spend the night with her children. And I went up to my office and just wrote sort of a 10-page treatment, and then I got in touch with the film company. Yeah. But other than that, it's often a chat with the director. Would you be interested? Yeah, I would, you know, but I can't think of anything. You know, obviously, say a book like that, I did a book with Roy Keane, and I didn't, you know, think, oh, I'd like to do a book with Roy Keane. I got this email saying, would you like to do a book with Roy Keane? It would never have occurred to me. One of the reasons I did it was because it would never, ever, ever have occurred to me to do a book with Roy Keane, or anyone else for that matter. So it was a bit of an adventure, you know. Again, it's words. But, so all those, the novels, the short stories, always me. The more collaborative stuff, I suppose quite rightly, is more collaborative. Yeah. And I like, you know, if I was writing a novel and somebody was looking over my shoulder and said, would you not do that? I would, you know, I'd be blunt and crude and say, would you ever fuck off? Yeah. Don't want it. Yeah. You know? Yeah. But when I'm doing work on a script and somebody says, well, maybe we can take out that scene and put in something else, I don't think this works. I'm taking notes. You know, the head is different. If a director or a good producer or if my literary agent suggests something, I listen. You know, I'd be a tick not to. You know, but it's different worlds. It's like if I'm doing a novel in the morning or something, a script in the afternoon, I don't literally walk from one room into another, but in a way, you remember the numbskulls, the cartoon characters? Yeah. So I'm going from one room in my head to another room in my head. Yeah. And the rules are different. Yeah. I think John Banville, funny enough, said something similar because he writes those detective books. I think I probably said it much better than he would have.
Well, it goes without saying, but it was sort of the right hand and the left hand, you know. I mean, that's interesting. I want to ask you about something that meant a lot to me when I saw it at the time, though, and it's one of the collaborative books, or one of the collaborative works, and I want to get into something here to do with the more recent books, but can you tell us a little bit about Family?
The 4-part series, 1994, yeah.
That was, for me personally, it was one of the most powerful experiences of television, and I think for a lot of people, I don't know if people remember it, but it was an extraordinary piece of work. And at that time, it was the ground shifted, you know.
Yes, I felt it. It was. I can tell you about how it came about. A man who became a friend of mine. It was a man called Andrew Eaton, who has since. He actually was the producer of the first series of The Crown. So Andrew was, and he had read The Commitments, and then he read The Snapper, and he wondered about producing The Snapper, but he was too late because Linda Miles, who had co-directed or co-produced The Commitments, and myself and herself decided that we'd make The Snapper together, and so that was up and running. But Andrew said, "I'd love you to meet a fellow called Michael Waring, Michael Waring at the time worked for the BBC, but he had produced Boys from the Black Stuff.
Oh yeah.
And Boys from the Black Stuff, I thought at the time, was the best thing I'd ever seen. It was extraordinary, and kids in the school were quoting, Yozzer Hughes, gives a job. I could do that. And I remember going up to the blackboard, and I was I'll think of his name in a minute. This kid behind me, I could do that, and perfectly timed, and the place bursting out, and so I got the dart into town to meet Michael Waring, and it was in a hotel on O'Connell Street, and on the way up from Tara Street Dart Station, I began to think a 4-part series, family, kind of almost, not literally, but metaphorically living next door to the rabbit family of the, if you like, of the snapper, the commitments in the van. Things aren't so good in that household. Each episode told from a different point of view. It would have a different look, a different soundtrack. I'll start with the father, because he's going to be an agent of a lot of the trouble. Then I'll have 2 kids, and then I'll finish with the mother. So by the time I got to the Gresham Hotel, where Michael Waring was staying, and met him and Andrew, I had that.
Yeah.
And I put the idea to them, and Michael Waring said, yeah, we'd love that. So I spent a year planning it, and a year writing the 4 episodes. And it was so straightforward in a way. Yeah. In a way, I hadn't a clue what I was doing again, and there's probably a benefit because I'd never written for television before. But then Michael Winterbottom, who has since done such great stuff, he had made a film, and I'm trying to remember it now, about alcoholism. It was absolutely brilliant. And a couple of episodes of Cracker. Do you remember Cracker with Robbie Coltrane? And I met Michael. Andrew's idea was that Michael would direct. If you ever met Michael, Michael now still looks like a 15-year-old. But Michael in 1992, I think, when I met him, I thought he was, in transition year. And like he was even wearing a pair of trousers, but the pockets had zips, so he wouldn't lose his bus fare. I don't know, it was quite... But anyway, Michael ended up directing it.
Yeah.
And it was an extraordinary experience watching it all come together. And then when it was broadcast, you could never anticipate these things. My head was bang up against it. I remember there was a press screening in London of the first episode, and Sean McGinley, who played Charlo Spencer, was sitting beside me. And he was speechless at the end of it because he hadn't seen a second of the thing. So he hadn't seen himself and what he was like. And he was really... that mixture of pride and distress, actually. It was amazing to witness it, and I knew, we've something on our hands here, But I could never have anticipated the volume of response to it. People who loved it and people who, God, Jesus, they hated it.
Yeah.
Hated me, hated it. Death threats, written in blood, terrible spelling.
Yeah.
It was really quite something. And then I remember getting a phone call. It was broadcast on Tuesdays. Half the adult population of Ireland watched the first episode. It was less than a year since I'd won the Booker Prize with Paddy Clarke. I'd written the commitments, I'd written the snapper. Despite telling people, this isn't the snapper, this isn't the snapper, half the population watched the first episode. More watched episode 2, more 3, and more 4. So the viewership kept rising. But I remember turning on the news on Wednesday morning, and I was the second item. Politicians were issuing statements, either approving or disapproving. Questions and answers, I was the item on questions and answers. John Bruton had policy on me. It was quite amazing, really. Writer, essentially, you're very private. And this was going on. And I remember... it was very difficult at times, but I remember feeling intensely proud.
Yeah.
Just to give it, it's hard to imagine now, but my mother, who in her prime was 5 foot tall, was walking down Kilbarrack Road, and a woman she knew was walking towards her and pushed her.
My God.
Yeah, pushed her. And my mother would have been in her 70s at this stage, but pushed her and said, if he was my son, I'd be ashamed. It's hard, isn't it, to imagine that happening now?
Yeah.
But that was only 1994. So, so it was harrowing. I remember I'm a football fan, and my team, Chelsea, were playing in the FA Cup final. I'm not trivialising it now, by the way, but the following, I think it was after the second episode, the FA Cup final was on, and I went to a pub in Raheny to watch it, and with friends of mine. And they had developed a way of kind of forming a wall without anybody saying it, so that we could have ourselves and people couldn't get near me. They weren't trying to batter me, but there were people trying to buy me pints and tell me, oh, you told my story. But it was Chelsea were hammered 4-0, I remember that. It was Saturday evening, and I went up to get the round, it was my round, and I was getting the pints, and the rush after evening mass, you're full of grace and you cross the pub to go into the pub, and people poured into the pub, and one guy said, Jesus, the priest was talking about you over there. He was hammering you. I was the sermon.
Yeah.
And I said, what did he say? Oh, he doesn't like you. He doesn't like you. And again, I just felt great, and I just got the pints, and it suddenly made the pain of watching Chelsea being hammered somewhat. Yeah. But it was actually, and I got a phone call from somebody in RTE after the first episode to reassure me that they had decided to go ahead and show the other episodes.
Yeah.
They had sat and talked about whether, because some craven attitude, they had debated whether they would go ahead because it had caused such a storm.
Yeah.
I'd like to think if I was involved in an organisation like that, I would say, come on, can we get more of this stuff? Let's really rattle the cage. But no, they had decided, and I got a phone call to reassure me that this was going to happen. Yeah. And but it was an amazing experience. Nothing you could. I know it was. As I said, I would never have anticipated it, and luckily, I've never thought in terms. I'll try to do that again, because if you tried to do it, it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was the most extraordinary thing I ever saw. I was in my 20s.
I've heard it said. It's lovely to hear. It's great to hear. It's great endorsement of everybody in the thing. Yeah. Jer Ryan, the acting, Nellie Conroy, the kids.
Yeah.
So Barry, who played John Paul, the boy.
Yeah.
I saw him in something recently, and he was playing a middle-aged man playing golf.
Oh God!
And I said, Jesus, that's Barry.
Yeah.
That was distressing now, I'll tell you, just to see that.
Yeah.
Because I missed a bit in the middle. He went from being John Paul to being this middle-aged man. I missed the middle bit.
It carried on then into novels, didn't it? I mean, it gave you Paula Spencer.
Family, it's a few months in the life of this family.
Yeah.
And I wondered, like a lot of people, we all know of bad marriages, and like, I was wondering, why did she get married in the first place? What did she see in him, And I thought, well, she's the one who tells the story. So I began to imagine her sitting at a table and writing her story. And that became the woman who walked into doors.
Yeah, yeah.
And it allowed me to go back right to her childhood. Yeah. And it allowed me to do more about, there was a lot more to her than just being a defeated woman at that point in her life,
Yeah.
And that point where in episode 3 where she hits him with the frying pan.
Yeah.
I wanted to go right the way back so that we go right to that moment again. The frying pan episode was inspired by Fawlty Towers.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
I just thought frying pan. I went into the kitchen and said, what is she likely to use? A knife is probably much more. I thought the consequences way too serious if it's a knife. Yeah. The rest of the writing the rest of the story is going to be very, very different. Whereas she hits him with the frying pan. Perfect.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And the clang rang out through the whole of the country,
I think you could hear the cheers.
Yeah, yeah.
But then Sean, for years, like, how are you, Charlo?
Yeah.
And people, he's a bit of a Charlo,
Yeah.
It's amazing, really. Yeah.
Extraordinary. And I think, I mean, without want to dwell too long on the dark side, I think there's something in the new books, the more recent books, the books that Smile, Love, and the recent one, that I find uncomfortable as a middle-aged man,
It gets no better, I can tell you that.
Right. Then I'm looking forward to the next one. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
no, I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about life.
Oh, right. Yeah. But,
you have absolutely nothing to look forward to. Just
great.
got to tell you that.
Yeah. But there's evil in, and I suppose I'm thinking, you think of the writer of The Commitments, and you're talking about that happy book and the joie de vivre or whatever and people see the film and it's soul music and it's all, sure, the band breaks up, but sure, geez, they had a blast. And then you put family into the mix and say this is the same imagination, and then I think you put,
I was a very young man.
Put smile in.
Yeah.
And I suppose maybe I'm going back to my earlier question about the ease with which the books have come, and maybe the more difficult they've become, maybe. And I suppose that the stakes seem to me to be getting higher.
Maybe, yeah, I'm not sure. I've never thought in those terms. The last one, Love, which is about that was fueled by grief, really. The death of my mother and the death of my best friend in the space of a couple of months. Two different experiences. Grief, it's a different experience every time. But I wrote it in a couple of months. And edited it, spent way more time editing than I normally would do. But it was a strange kind of energy. And the other one, Smile, which you mentioned beforehand, I think it's inspired by school days. I was never physically abused. Well, I was beaten, but I was never sexually abused by a Christian brother. But it happened in the school. And we used to kind of, I suppose, one of the ways you coped collectively, you'd laugh about it, joke about it. We all do. And it wasn't that, when people say, I had no idea that was going on in the country. Well, we did. But maybe because we were so young, we didn't have the language for it. We didn't understand the implications, perhaps. So we joked about it. But it was no joke, And I think that nostalgia for the past, what's going on in Britain at the moment, this people pining for the war years. They weren't alive during the war years, and probably it's not something to pine for, really. People pining for the good old days, and I don't know how many people. Well, if it hadn't been for the Christian Brothers, we'd have no education. What a strange way to look at it, And I remember one day in the pub, a friend of mine, and he had another guy with him who I didn't really know. He was maybe 2 years younger than us. There were 4 of us. 3 of us went to the same school. That's why we were friends. Back at the classroom, enduring the boredom of the class. Nothing like laughter if you know you're going to be killed. If you're caught laughing. I think there should be a day in school where there should be corporal punishment 1 day a year. So that children become acquainted with the illegality of laughter. I'm being semi-serious. Comes too easy to them now. In my day. But so we were talking about one Christian brother in particular, and we knew, we could say it. We had the language, we had parenthood, etc. We were able to say he sexually abused people, not us. We were lucky in that regard. And we remember, and the guy beside us sat up and he said, him. They had moved him from my school to his school, and he was doing the same thing there. And then they moved him on, I'm sure. And they moved him on. And that's where I reached a point in my life where I felt, with Smile, I don't know, I was probably in my 50s, was it? Yeah, I was in my 50s. And now's the time. Now's the time to tell the story as a mature man. And the character, the pain of his is that he's endured, he's had to live with that and deny it and push it back, way, way back to his head. And that's been his life. A disaster, really, because of what happened in the classroom. Didn't happen me, but it did happen people, And that's where the inspiration for that story came from. To be honest, when I start a story, whether it's going to be dark or a mixture or whatever, doesn't really interest me. It's the validity of it. Is there a story there? Can I keep on going till I finish it? And I really didn't know where I was going with that one. I had a vague idea. It was one of the worrying ones because that's the one I'm doing at the moment. I don't know how it's going to end, really. So in that case, I didn't know how it was going to end. And that's where you have to trust yourself. Like, you have to say, well, if I keep on going, something will open up for me. And sometimes it feels it's not going to happen, but it's always happened eventually, whether it's a short story or more a novel, something opens up. And that may not be the final door you need, but there's another door further on, and that opens up. And that's how that book was written, just pushing me way through, to get to the end. Not because it was, as I say, not because it was personal experience, but the one episode I could draw on, if you like, that made, or two. One, I used it eventually creatively in a short story, was when I was beaten by a late teacher. And I remember his sweat hitting me. And I met a guy, he was standing outside a bank in Fairview years later, decades later, went to school, and he had been beaten the same day by the teacher. This guy didn't teach us. He wandered to school looking for excuses to hit batter you. And I'll never forget the pain. I'll never forget it. And it was, so I went over to him, and he was at the bank arranging, because his father had just died, and he was making the bank arrangements. And we met for a drink a while later. The very first thing he brought up was that beating. This is two men in their 50s. And so that kind of has often fueled me. It's often. But the other was in first year, where we were at the Christian Brother. He wasn't the worst at all. Some of them were fine, it's the usual. But he wasn't the worst at all. Occasionally, something clicked and he became a monster, but he wasn't the worst. He loved his subject, which was great as well, very rare. But we were at him not to give us homework. And he said, "Roddy Doyle, I can never resist your smile." And I felt the floor literally gone. 30-odd boys hearing this Christian Brother, strange-looking man at the front, saying that to a 13-year-old boy. He never actually told me to stay back after class. He never put a hand on me. But it took months to recover from that. It was so inappropriate, so wrong, at many, many levels, as a teacher myself. Jesus, the idea of saying that to anybody was just, and it was just, maybe he probably didn't mean any harm, whatever, but he never said it to anybody else. And I was the queer, I was, the faggot. Luckily I had friends who, weren't interested in distancing me or anything like that. But again, that, so when I was thinking of the story, I was thinking I can edge myself closer to the experience by imagining that again. I didn't have to imagine it because I lived it. So, and again, it's a tiny little episode, but the tiny episode can get you towards the bigger experience.
It's a brilliant book, folks. It's
Thank
a
you.
brilliant book.
Thank you.
Extraordinary, and I think, just to go back to the craft, it's a beautifully crafted book. It sneaks up on you, you know.
Well, that's back to editing. That's where I get down on the floor, I print it out, and first draft is often a mess. First time I really had to deal with the fourth book, Paddy, Clarke, isn't a linear story, And I had all the pages out, and I was saying, well, I'll put that page with that page, that episode with that episode. And gradually I began to see Paddy Clarke as being sort of a spiral, where the spiral gets smaller and smaller until he's confronted with something he can't avoid, that his parents' marriage is broken up, and he's poor kid, he's brought into this world that he doesn't want, this adult world that he doesn't want. It's not uncommon, but that's the lesson for me there was, so it's not just the words that you edit, it's actually the shape of the book. And Paula Spencer was another one. I told the story on 3 parallel tracks, her present, her recent past, and then her distant past. And I thought, more obvious, if I'm imagining Paula sitting writing her story, she's more likely to start at the beginning and work her way through. And I said, that might be more accurate, but actually it'd be very hard to keep people going. It's certainly hard to keep me, so I broke it up. But that didn't come until I'd finished the first draft, I remember when the book came out, there were people on the radio talking about the book. And this would be the attitude at the time of some of the commentators about me generally, or my work. And they said, I don't know if Roddy Doyle intended this, but the book is very cleverly structured. And I thought, I'm the monkey type in Hamlet,
just
you know.
just all,
He'll eventually get
fell out that way,
through the last soliloquy.
Yeah.
And, Jesus. So, like, talk about, cleverly. But yeah, so they a lot of the work, when you thank you, structure the craft, is in the editing. But again, you have to get to the end and the mess of a first draft to be able to do that.
It's very surprising book as it sort of unfolds, unfolds like a piece of origami or something.
Well, part of that is because I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
But it's a bit like, if you write something well, if you write something that's hopefully is a joyous thing, like there's The Snapper, for example, and you write something like that, and people say, "Oh, you must have had a great time writing that." In a way, the achievement is people thinking that it was easy, that you had a great time, because it's not. And it's the same with something like with people. Oh, it's really slick, and it's really the work. Again, I don't want to watch anybody. I don't want anybody to watch me working because it's boring. But the work goes into making it seem seamless or easy or whatever.
Yeah. How are we for time? Soon enough. Yeah. We'll just say a little bit about the book of short stories, which I'm enjoying at the moment. I've read about half of it.
Oh, the COVID stories.
The COVID stories, because I think coping with COVID, we've all had such a. We were actually talking earlier how weird it is to look back and think 5 kilometres and being locked in your house, and
it was 2 at one stage.
Extraordinary. I mean, do you want to say a little bit about the book?
I mean, I had started a novel, and I was actually in the UK when the lockdown was imposed here in Ireland, and the UK was still pretending there was nothing happening. And I felt really strange coming home. I felt like, was it Typhoid Mary? At the airport, carrying the disease into the country. But once I got the hang of it, and what the rules were, and it was strange. People forget. I mean, I forget, and I remind myself. We were frightened of inhaling and exhaling. We were frightened of touching things. We, were terrified of stuff we brought from the supermarket. How do I get that out of the package without touching the package? We didn't have masks. We didn't have a lot of the phrases that we became acquainted with. We thought it might last a couple of months. And I looked at the novel and I realised it was completely redundant. It was set in the present day, and that didn't exist anymore, and it was never going to exist in the same way again. So it's the only time I've ever dumped a work in progress like a novel, but I did. And then I was getting calls. A tour of Commitments musical I was involved in was cancelled. A new play cancelled. A revival of another play cancelled. I got all that in the space of a week and a half. And my novel was coming out. Love was coming out in March. Postponed. Everything. My whole year, professional year, was gone. And I just, luckily, I thought, well, the way to capture this, because things were happening so quickly, was short stories. So I began to write a short story, and it became more. The first one was inspired by being in Newcastle upon Tyne when Ireland was going into lockdown, and the hens and the stag parties were going on in Newcastle. And I felt so odd being, it's only about 35 minutes on a plane, but it felt like a different planet, hearing what was going on in Ireland and reading it, So that was the first, and then I thought of another one and another one and another one. I began to go for the walk along, lucky I live near the sea, so I was walking along Dublin Bay and observing the same people, and you're doing the slalom, avoiding people, and now and again you meet someone and you're, how are you? So I wrote a story inspired by somebody walking. The last one is called The Five Lamps, which is a feature on the North Strand, not far from where I live. And it's set in the first couple of days of the first lockdown, but I wrote it a year later, and it was so hard to get my head back to that year. And I don't think, say, if you were living in 2019 and you'd think, what was it like in 2018? Exactly the same as it is in 2019. You're in 2021. What was it like in 2020? So different. So it was really hard to get back. We weren't even using the word COVID then. It was the corona.
Yeah.
Like in Dublin, you put the before.
Yeah.
So it was the corona.
Yeah.
And then it became the COVID. But I kind of had to keep revising, no, didn't have that. Mandatory isn't the word he'd think. That came later. All these phrases that we had. And so it was brilliant because it kept me occupied. And I realized, actually, I began to think, well, these are quite good,
Yeah.
And they not only capture people in that moment, they also capture some of the people at a point in their lives in that moment.
Yeah.
People kind of realizing, because they're locked up together, oh, I like this person. And you would expect the opposite.
Yeah.
So no, I'll
Yeah.
do that. And paranoia, deep worry. There's a couple I really, in the story I really enjoyed, an aspect. I decided that, their kids didn't come home. They didn't want the kids home for the lockdown either. They're finished with the kids, and they had their own. They had a room in the house. Whenever they needed to talk about the kids, they'd go up to the room and shut the door and talk about the kids in that room, like it was the White House. The situation room,
Yeah.
So there's a bit of fun in that,
Yeah.
So it was. It allowed me to use the little glimpses of life that I was getting, and the strange restrictions that we were living, to use them creatively in a way. So. Like I hope I never have to write another. Well, I don't have to write anything, but I hope I'm not in a lockdown somewhere thinking, I'll write the sequel.
I suppose reading through it, it's a fantastic documentary nearly of what it was like. Oh yeah, I was thinking, and yet, I mean, it has for me, the stories are picking up many of the themes and ideas we've already touched on.
People who work in supermarkets became essential workers, and to me that seemed right and proper. It was brilliant. Things that were thought to be impossible became possible.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there. And you remember when I don't know when it became possible to have takeaways delivered.
Yeah, yeah.
And a guy that you'd hardly have paid attention to when he delivered the takeaway, like he was
like an angel.
Oh, Jesus,
Yeah.
Like people, I have an image of a whole family coming to the door to wave as he goes away.
Yeah.
Because they're so like cotton ships on the step, and they're waving. Thank you.
Yeah.
Probably gave him £100 as a tip.
Yeah.
And so it allowed humour and the darker stuff as well, because it's there.
Yeah.
And that awful, there's, when somebody you love dies, there's comfort in numbers. When the church is full or whatever, there's nothing sadder than an empty church, really, when there's a wedding on. When there's a funeral on, really, it's hard to.
Yeah.
You just want to. I wish I could multiply just to fill the place a bit.
Yeah.
But I remember feeling, and I never knew I would. So when my father died, there were a lot of people in the church, and I was thinking, there is definite comfort there.
Yeah.
And you couldn't even have a proper funeral. So again, there's a story about that. And I'd imagine, 10 people allowed to the funeral. Some people are going to be deeply, deeply hurt.
Yeah.
You can use this as, a weapon to get at somebody,
Yeah.
So I just saw all sorts of prospects in what we were living through at the time.
Yeah. They're great. The stories are great, and that one you mentioned, I'm going to finish on this because we're getting the signals there. Is
ignore them.
There's a short one called Masks, and I thought there was a great kind of fuck you to the pandemic in it.
Yeah.
The guy wears them.
Yeah. Do you remember when when the mask started to be a thing, and you'd see a mask on the ground? It was just, good God, like it seemed so intimate.
Yeah.
It's not something you should ever throw on the ground, and now you don't even notice the things really.
Yeah.
It's bizarre, but that was written at the time.
Yeah.
And he's absolutely outraged, but then he decides to use the masks creatively for the first time in his life.
It's a great metaphor as well, Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you.
And I should say, Smile, Love, and Life Without Children, all available upstairs and in all good bookshops.
Grand, and even the bad ones.
And even bad ones. I've really enjoyed chatting to you.
So have I. Thank you very, very much.
And you're always welcome in Wexford. Sure, you're one of our own.
I am. Thank you. Thanks very much.